Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast. And recently in the mail from Rocklove, I got this pretty cool necklace. It's got Black Lotus on the front. It's got Magic the Gathering card back on the back. It's sterling silver, which is really cool. And it's actually from their brand new Lotus line. Go and check it out. A bunch of really cool stuff inspired by Black Lotus. Now, Black Lotus is probably the most famous card in all of Magic. And it got me thinking, I have never done a video on Lotus. I mean, I've been doing this over 2 years now. I've never done a video talking about the Lotuses of Magic. Well, I thought today, let's dig in a little bit and do just that. Check it out. When Magic the Gathering released in 1993, with it came Black Lotus. Present in just Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited, the name Lotus alone in Magic conjures power. It's funny that a flower is the object whispered about in our game like a legend, but it's true. I don't know about you, but even when I see the word Lotus anywhere in the real world, I immediately think of Magic. From seeing one in a garden, to shows like the White Lotus, to the car line. Magic is where my mind goes first. If you want a deep dive on Black Lotus itself, other YouTubers have covered this at length, like Ristic Studies in his masterclass video simply entitled The Black Lotus. If you haven't seen it before, check it out. So today, I'm going to focus on something that is a major lineage of Magic the Gathering, the Lotus. In Magic the Gathering, there are 16 cards that carry the word Lotus in their name. One of them is Black Lotus. Two of them, Lotus Eye Mystics and Lotus Path Jin, we can discount. The Lotus there being reference to a flavorful piece of the Jeskai in Khans of Tarkir block, not Black Lotus. Perhaps a mistake given the cachet of the word Lotus. But that leaves 13 remaining cards from Magic's nearly 30-year history that all harken back to that original piece of the Power 9. Each of them can draw a path of ancestry directly back to Black Lotus. Let's start with number 1. It all began in Weatherlight, a set released in June 1997, just 4 years after those first alpha cards graced shelves. The game was in its infancy. This set, featuring the Weatherlight crew and their adventures, kicked off a major story arc for Magic. And what better for the crew to come upon than a field of Lotus? Enter Lotus Vale. This card asked the question of what if Black Lotus was a land? While still providing 3 mana, the need to sacrifice 2 untapped lands made it very hard to use. It doesn't actually put you up on mana at all. Or does it? If you're keen with Magic rules, you might have noticed that the use of the word win would allow you to play it and tap it for 3 mana before sacrificing it, quietly making this a Black Lotus of its own and would be one of the most powerful Magic cards of all time. But before you rush out to get your copies, you should know that before the Magic rules changes of 6th edition in 1999, players couldn't respond to abilities that happened when cards came into play. You would play your Lotus Veil, and the sacrifice was immediate, no responses. So this card, as well as the similarly worded Mox Diamond, received errata that persists to this day, a replacement ability that makes the card work how it was intended. Lotus Veil is a bit of a head scratcher on how to use it. That hasn't stopped people from trying, but especially printed into a world where Wasteland was about to make its debut appearance in Tempest, it was a tough one. Speaking of Tempest, that takes us to our next card. Clearly the team at the time was ready to push some nostalgia buttons, because in Magic's next expansion after Weatherlight, Tempest, there was another riff on Lotus. And this one ended up a little less tame, Lotus Petal. Featuring excellent flavor text and rules text that is only a third of Black Lotus, it turns out that's still plenty. It sees play even today in Legacy and is restricted to just 1 copy in Vintage, a format where everything is legal. One wild fact to keep in mind about this card, it was common. That does mean it's legal in Pauper, where occasionally it gets up to shenanigans. Using a card for 1 free mana becomes more and more powerful the more cards you have access to. In Standard, it's not even clear Lotus Petal would see play, but it's restricted in Vintage. A free mana is just too risky of a card to make, especially when you factor in that it's an artifact you can find ways to reuse. but I'll always appreciate this riff on Black Lotus. The third one in the lineage is actually stronger than Black Lotus. Well, once anyway. And that would be Blacker Lotus from 1998's detour into the jokey nature of Unglued. This silver-bordered reference took the gag of being one of the most sought-after cards in the game, making it stronger, but you have to rip it up to use it. Is it actually a funny joke? I'll let all of you in the comments weigh in. Moving swiftly back to regular Magic, we have Urza Saga. This is a block known for its broken artifact cards and turn 1 kills. So it's a little funny that then its artifact riff on Black Lotus was a total stinker. Lotus Blossom gives you 1 mana back each turn it's in play. So if you drop it on the second turn, on turn 4, you can use it to accelerate into a 6-drop. That doesn't even sound good by today's standards, and considering the environment of the time was full of combo decks that would annihilate you within the first couple turns, this card failed to really get much use, though it certainly generated a lot of discussion. The word Lotus alone commands power, and while this card wasn't ultimately strong, it was in range for a riff on a Lotus. It was something people talked about as a way you could generate a lot of mana. It was still a reasonable way to do a Lotus. That's unlike the next entry, a card which really sullied the Lotus brand, taking the cake for the worst of them. I remember being new at Magic and opening a booster pack of Invasion. I had heard the legends of Black Lotus. Even then, at 11 years old, the name had cachet. I flipped to the back and spotted a card with Lotus in the name. No doubt a powerhouse. I remember thinking this card was unimpressive, but because it had the word Lotus, it had to be good. Well, it turns out that even at 11 years old, my gut instinct was the right idea with this one, Lotus Guardian. It's the estranged uncle at the Lotus family reunion, invited only because he's family. A 7-mana 4/4 creature that taps for 1 mana, it's neither fast mana, a cheap artifact, something that sacrifices, or nearly anything else you have come to expect from a Lotus. There's an important design lesson here. If you're going to try and use nostalgia to get people excited, and you're using something that has a lot of meaning, put it in places people will get excited about. Don't put somebody on the Lotus roller coaster if it's not going to be an exciting experience. That's unlike the next riff, which I think might be the high watermark for Lotus design. You see, 2003's Mirrodin was an artifact set, and with its fresh new frame, it needed some incredible artifacts. And what better to tap into than a Lotus? It was time for Gilded Lotus. This design is so simple, yet so exciting. It's a Black Lotus that doesn't sacrifice. Perfect. A 5-mana artifact any deck can play that bursts you up 3 more mana starting the next turn. Eminently incredibly fair and also unfair. At the same time, this is still a commander and cube card today. And when someone plays one, you always acknowledge its power, but also that it's a 5-mana card. You get to do strong stuff at 5 mana. It also points you in the right direction. Instead of being free and accelerating you to broken things early before your opponents can react, it costs mana, but then accelerates you to your most powerful and expensive to cast cards. I love Gilded Lotus. That's not to say it hasn't been used for some broken stuff though. Let me tell you about a deck most of you have never heard of. One of my favorite Pro Tours of all time was Pro Tour New Orleans. Mirrodin had just released and the format was extended. If you don't know what that is, I did a video on it, you can watch here. And while the format had received many bans, Urza's block was still legal, as was Tinker. It was time to go nuts with all the Mirrodin artifacts. A lot of people tinkered for Mindslaver, of course. One cute deck called Final Fantasy tinkered up Platinum Angel, and then one with Isochron Scepter plus Final Fortune. But one of my favorites is this deck a Japanese team brought, Twiddle Desire. Designed by future Hall of Famer Tsuyoshi Fujita, the deck would tinker for a Gilded Lotus. Then you'd use literal twiddle alongside other unplayable cards like Burst of Energy and Dream's Grip to untap the Lotus for mana. You'd then use that mana to cast Meditate or Trade Secrets to find more twiddles before finally finding a Mind's Desire, which would keep the chain rolling until you hit a Tendrils of Agony. Absolutely delightful. The next Lotus on the list adds the most mana, and that's Mox Lotus in Unhinged. Another foray into a joke meta-referencing set. What better to joke about than the Power 9 design itself with this card that taps to add infinity mana, I guess. You can at least use it to cast your Gleemax. I mean, it's one Gleemax, Michael. What could it cost? 1,000,000 mana? Now I want to talk about one of my favorites of all time. It's either this or Gilded Lotus for me. Time Spiral in 2006 was a set all about nostalgia, referencing Magic's past. And so of course, there would need to be a Lotus somewhere. There was one marriage in particular that made sense. Suspend, a new mechanic where you paid with time. So the team set off to make a Suspend Lotus variant. You could suspend it for 0 and then wait some number of turns before getting your Lotus. Looking back at the design notes on the card, it delighted me that the first ever one was simply this from designer Matt Place. Absurd. Because that really is how the world felt when they saw Lotus bloom for the first time. This was a real earth-shattering reveal. Was every deck going to play this card now? The forums were abuzz. I can only imagine how the design team must have been feeling. They waffled between Suspend 3 and Suspend 4 for a long time before finally settling on Suspend 3. While Gilded Lotus was an eminently fair card with some unfair applications, Lotus Bloom threatened to be a burst of 3 mana that could power out big plays on the 4th turn. Doubling down further, it was made the pre-release card. The final design comment was similarly simple and an act of finger crossing. We better not miss on this. So what happened? Did it turn out okay? Well, it didn't end up being great in any fair decks. The variance of drawing it and being able to use the mana was too high. Instead, it powered a handful of specific unfair strategies, from turn 4 Dragon Storms to coming back with Second Sunrise in older formats. But I view this card as a success, because to me, Lotus Bloom is the modern day Black Lotus. It's exactly the game text of Black Lotus once it's in play, and gives you the same feeling of power when it unsuspends that ripping Black Lotus off the top does. It's a powerful card, and it has variants. So many combo decks are better when they have their Lotus Bloom in their opener, but there's also a real cost of playing it, as it's a dead draw later in the game. It generated so much excitement, only ended up being good in a handful of decks, and feels powerful. And while yes, for those who were playing back then, it did ultimately contribute to a problematic standard environment alongside Dragonstorm, playing with this card comes the closest to capturing the mystique of the original in modern Magic for me. I'm usually pretty wary of cards that will either do nothing or fuel combo decks. But in the case of a Lotus, it feels like exactly the right place to take an exciting risk to me. Moving ahead to 2009's Zendikar, we have one you will likely recognize, Lotus Cobra. The only one of the bunch that's a color, this connection is tenuous at best. It's a snake that makes mana when you play lands. The only sacrificing involved here is your fetch lands, powering out 2 mana at a time. It's an incredibly powerful mana creature, but doesn't feel so much like a Lotus to me because of the reliance on lands and the fact it's green. But it's a sweet card nonetheless. If Lotus Guardian was the estranged uncle, this is like the cool aunt. Yeah, it's a little weird you're at this family reunion, but we do like you, so sure. But in that family, there were no new members for a while. After a cadence of seeing one at least every couple of years, it took a decade for the next new card with Lotus in the name. And this one, I think, is particularly interesting because it's a riff on another Lotus riff, Lotus Field. Remember Lotus Vale? This tries to solve some of the problems with that card. The hexproof part means you don't get easily blown out, and it just enters tapped, meaning it doesn't need a replacement effect, though it is quite good with Amulet of Vigor. This card has gone to fuel a goofy Pioneer combo deck where you untap Lotus Field a lot, harkening back to Twiddle Desire, maybe just a tiny bit. I'd say that's a fine legacy for a Lotus. There's one more goofy Lotus to look at, and this one is easy to miss in searches since it comes from Mystery Booster, Mirrored Lotus. It asks the question, is a Black Lotus so good if my opponent gets one too? This is the kind of card that would break in half if it was legal in any Eternal formats, since you just kill your opponents the turn you play it. But for the limited experience of Mystery Booster, a quite interesting card. Power out your big thing and hope they can't top it. There's only 2 more left. The next one is Nyx Lotus, a Therosian take on a Gilded Lotus. This is a totally solid design, which, if anything, feels a little underused. It can add a ton of mana, though it does fluctuate. It calls back to Nykthos, an interesting angle where a Lotus is calling back to a card that wasn't a Lotus before. And that brings us to the newest Lotus, harkening from 2020, Jeweled Lotus. And what a controversial card this one was. It's a black Lotus just for your commander. It generated no end of buzz when the set was previewed. So 2 years in, what do I think? Well, overall, I'm not a huge fan. While I don't think it's a staple of every deck like people theorized it might be originally, this is the kind of card which speeds up the format and can create a number of non-games. You drop your ridiculous commander early, get super far ahead, and the game becomes archenemy as you snowball, provided you don't just kill them all with Godo or something. The upside of letting you cast your big mana cost commanders early to make them more viable is cool, but probably wasn't worth the impact across the format as a whole. That said, one nice thing about Commander is that it's a format where you can opt into certain power bands, cards, and playstyles, so it fortunately regulates pretty well, and I don't see the card create non-games that often, just put somebody into a good position. But still, it's a risky kind of card to make, and I'm not personally super interested in making more like this. But what do you think about Jeweled Lotus? Let me know in the comments down below. It does tickle me to no end though that some people have tried playing it in Legacy, in a combo deck which uses doubling cube. The mana doesn't have the same restriction once doubled. Hilarious. There you have it, a Lotus lineage. 13 cards that were all inspired in some way from the most famous card in the game. With us going back to Dominaria shortly, is there another Lotus on the horizon? Only time will tell. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, be sure to subscribe for more. I'll talk with you again soon, and in the meantime, may you find the burst of mana you need. You got this. Eventually, lead designer Brian Hawley came up with what he really wanted, a land where you chose 2 colors in deck building. It was wacky and new for sure, but he also argued that if there was a place to try it, a master set was a fine spot to experiment. It's a low stakes draft experience that will only be going on